Okay, so we are going to talk about another class of languages today, particularly languages which are either drifting into new languages, or maybe they're not drifting, maybe they're targeting into new languages, and where languages are mixed, often called code switching, because we are really interested in all languages that people actually speak and not just official languages which happen to be what countries define what the languages are going to be. Most people in the world are multilingual, okay? And it's only unusual that the people from United Kingdom and America are monolingual, and they're a really weird bunch compared to the rest of the planet. But most people are speaking multiple languages. They go through life, they grow up speaking multiple languages. They have languages for different reasons. They have languages they speak at home, the languages they speak at the university, in education, the languages they speak in business. And these are often quite different languages, and historically they can come from quite different roots. They can be colonial languages, they can be other local languages that are maybe related to something, but they're doing it. And that definition is not always well defined. And sometimes people will just call it a dialect. Sometimes people will just say, well, that's city speak as opposed to the rural speech. Sometimes people will speak these two languages and quite distinct languages at the same time. I mean, not overlapping, but sharing words and sharing grammar of them. And so obviously we're quite used to this idea where you're borrowing a word from another language when you're speaking, but you also find that it's very common amongst groups of people who know the languages and know that the other people know the languages, that they'll flip between the language within the sentence and possibly even within the word. So you get two languages in the one space, okay? And this can actually even get within the word, where especially where we have a rich morphology language, where you're borrowing a word and then you're doing something to it. You're adding some form of conjugation to it. You're doing plural from one language to the other, so it's relatively common. When we do this, we call this code switching or code mixing. And there are some groups of people on the planet do it almost all the time and can't even work out when they're not doing it. But I'd like to point out that for any of you who only speak one language, and I'll naively assume that if you only speak one language, it's English, because if it's not English, you won't understand what I say. Monolinguals do this all the time, actually, because they flip dialects as well. So they will say something in standard English, if we're talking about English, and then they might say something in Scots dialect afterwards to get a laugh out of people or something, because they're trying to do something with what they're speaking. So they're flipping between dialects, which in some sense can be code switching. And even if you don't do that, think if you're a monolingual person, when you swear, okay, there are only some circumstances it's acceptable to swear and some circumstances where it's not. And depending who you're talking to, what you're talking about, you may choose between these different dialects, swear words and other crude forms, as opposed to maybe a more standard form that you might do if you're standing up. And that's the same idea, that there's some mixture of language choice, vocabulary, possibly grammar as well that's going on, okay? This colloquial, formal, or swear word or form is relatively formal in all languages, but in some communities, this is an actual split between completely different languages, okay? Sometimes these forms of language come up out of necessity, where you have two groups of people who do not speak the same language, and what they're trying to do is find a lingua franca. They're trying to find a way to communicate. And what happens is a new language gets developed, and that new language is actually maybe a mixture of both languages. It's often a simplification because nobody's a native speaker, and it allows them to be able to communicate. These are often called pidgins. They're often referred to as maybe not official languages, but they're actually how people communicate. And over time, they become quite formal, and they become the standard way that people communicate. Sometimes they're actually called pidgin in the name. And what often happens is that pidgin becomes the thing that people speak. And then after a while, people start speaking at home, and then as they're bringing up kids, the kids learn it natively. And when the kids speak it, we usually linguistically call that a Creole rather than a Pidgin, because there's now native speakers of the language, and native speakers of a language are allowed to make other decisions about the direction of the language. It's not fully defined, but we usually define Creoles as having native speakers, even though they may be derived from other languages and maybe multiple languages, while Pidgins are ones where there are no native speakers. Although we often refer to languages or dialects by Pidgin and Creole, and we're not necessarily following that particular rule. Okay. Creoles have native speakers, Pidgins do not yet. But actually, when a language is called a Creole or a Pidgin, linguistically, that's what we mean. But actually, there are actual languages on the planet that are maybe called a Creole or Pidgin, and they might not be an actual Pidgin or a Creole. They're all derived and mixed from some other language, but they're on their way to being a maybe more formal native language for a particular area. I'm going to play some here. Typically, Pidgins are not written, they're speech communication, and so the writing systems for them are somewhat non-standard, and therefore they can be quite difficult to read, even though people can understand them quite well. Think about dialects of English, if you're not aware about, or dialects of Chinese that you're not used to actually seeing written. Shanghaiese might be understandable to you, but you don't really know how to write it. And when you're trying to read somebody who's written it, it's hard to do because you're just not used to seeing that. Okay. So the first one I'm going to play here is Jamaican patois. Patois is another word for a Creole. That's a Creole spoken in Jamaica, and it has a certain amount of English in it. And so you'll sort of understand some of this. So, you know, it doesn't look anything like English, but this says 14 generations. And so you can begin to understand that. And the more you listen to it, you'll be able to pick up more. And there are some things that are not English based, they're actually from other indigenous languages. But after a while, you'll learn to be able to understand Bob Marley when he sings these songs, being one of the more famous international users of Jamaican patois. Similarly, in the same area, Haitian Creole, often just called Creole, is the language that's spoken on Haiti. It is derived from French. Some people consider it to be not a real language and just a bad version of French. Other people say, no, it's quite distinct. And it is true that in education in Haiti, people may be taught standard continental French as well, and they may be able to move into that. And when they're writing, they will often move into that, although typically Haitian Creole is written much more phonetically than what continental French is. And I'm not here to complain about how badly continental French is written with all the last letters of words not being pronounced. I'm an English speaker. How can I ever complain about spelling? But here's an example of Haitian Creole. If you know French, you might be able to understand some of it, but probably not all of it. Do we have any French speakers? We do have some French speakers, yes. Right, okay, and you certainly can't read it. No, but because it's not written the same way as French at all, but actually you'd be able to attune to it faster than the rest of us. To me, it sounds very French, but of course it doesn't mean it's French, okay? Now, we all speak English, I'm assuming, and English is arguably a Creole and maybe even code switched, depending what you look at it, between Saxon and Norman French. The fundamental grammar of English is mostly Germanic, And a lot of the lexicon and a lot of some parts of the grammar are actually from Norman French, very Latinate. And they've been mixed for some 800 years, okay? And it's true, even if you're a non-native, you can generate things in English that make it sound more elaborately formal and more base and crude. And often what you're doing there is you're actually using French or Latin grammar rather than the Saxon Germanic forms. There's lots of words where there's multiple words that mean basically the same thing. And historically, they come from the different people who were speaking these languages. The languages for animals, especially animals we eat in English, are usually Germanic. So this is things like swine or pig or cow, as opposed to the words that we have for these animals when we eat them as meat. We have quite distinct words because the rich people were eating the meat, and therefore they're often Norman French words like pork and beef. They come from French, and there's lots of things that are actually like that. But it's 800 years is actually quite a long time for a language. Not all languages survive that long and still be in some sense mutually intelligible, although English from 800 years ago is quite hard to understand unless you speak German.
So how do you differentiate between languages which are derived from other languages and the Creoles?
Yeah, so it's really hard to do. Some linguist has to come along and say, look at these distinctions and know something about the history as well. So, English is an Indo-European language, and we can talk about what we think Proto-Indo-European was, which is the root language of all of Europe and much of the Middle East and at least northern India. There's some history of shared form there that we can come with. And we're not saying that in general, these are Creoles. We say that they've generated over time, but most of the Creoles and Pidgins are something that happened when invasion or trade happened, and therefore you have much more localized and usually a historical event that we actually identify. So that's usually the distinction. While just because we saw things in Russian where there's lots of things that are Indo-European, there's lots of things that are borrowed from Greek as well, in the same way that things are borrowed from Greek in English, often scientific terms. And that's sort of different than having something like a Tok Pidgin that's spoken in Papua New Guinea that is a pidgin of English and is modified form, I think. These are linguistic terms, and we must be aware of that. And they're useful to talk about in terms of linguistics, but the name of the language and how it actually gets treated, and be also aware that there's lots of non-trivial political aspects of the definitions of what these languages actually are. All of the different languages in China, okay, are called dialects. They are not called different languages, even though they are more different than the European languages. And that's probably political, okay? The Arabic is usually termed as a single Arabic with different dialects across the different Arabic-speaking countries, even though the difference between Moroccan Arabic and Iraqi Arabic is as different as the difference between English and Polish, okay? So they're pretty distinct. There's common words, but they're not the same language. But the Arabic-speaking world wants to keep it as a single language and then talk about dialects. And so it's a lot of politics are going on here. And so when you're actually doing language technologies, sometimes you'll be looking at dialect distinctions, and sometimes you'll be looking at language distinctions. You just be aware that you should look at what the differences actually are rather than what the name of these things actually are, because it can be hard to fully define that. Often Pidgins in Creole, because they are more recent, are much more to do with speech communication than they are to do with writing. People might not actually write them down, or there's no standard way of doing it. For Europe during the Middle Ages, there was a written language called Latin that everybody who did read and write would read and write. And then there was what's called Vulgar Latin, which now means something that's crude, something that's not well spoken. Well, in fact, all it meant was the common tongue that people were actually speaking, what people actually spoke. And it was drifting away from the written form of Latin. Same thing as what's happening today in Arabic. The written form of Arabic is much more standardized, while the spoken form is different. Okay. This means that when you're looking at these forms, it can often be really hard to find examples, because when people write things down, they go into their formal mode. And so you don't often get colloquial forms. When people were writing down things in the Middle Ages, 1500, they write in Latin. And why would they write in English or French or German? I mean, that would just be weird to do. That's not what we do. We write things in Latin so that everybody can read it. What's the point of doing it in some local language? And so often that's still the case. I think as standard English, I mean, the difference between different English dialects throughout the world actually disappears a little bit when you actually start writing things down. So this means that you might not be able to find good examples of a Pidgin or a Creole or code switching, which might be the pre-Pidgin, because people are not writing it down. Okay, of course, until recently. Yeah.
Are Creoles normally adopted as official languages?
So,
for example, the Cape Verde Creole,
yeah,
despite the fact that everyone speaks it, it's not the official language, it's Portuguese. I was curious if there's any case where Creole is actually the official language of the.
So the linguistic definition is, are there native speakers? Okay, the political definition is somewhat arbitrary. Haitian Creole is just called Creole. If you ask people in Haiti what language they speak, they'll say Creole.
Yeah, but is it the government official language?
Yes. Yeah. Code switching is when people are communicating when they have good fluency, usually in two languages, and they're mixing them. Okay, it's usually only happens in casual speech and text, casual text, which we get on social media. It's usually face to face. It's usually something that is not in official documents. It's usually not something that you see the government supports. It's not something that's taught in education and schools, but it's how people actually communicate. Often it's defined in terms of what's often called a matrix language. So there's an underlying language that's being used, and then there's things being mixed on top of it. Okay. For those of you who speak Hindi, you're probably nowadays speaking English, because you're actually mostly speaking with a Hindi matrix language with lots of English on top of it. Okay. In the same way that I said English is really a Saxon language with lots of Norman French inside it. Okay, and that's sort of what it is nowadays. Now, I'm not talking about Indian English, which is its own English on the planet, and actually it's the most common English on the planet. So they actually get to define what the rest of us speak, and so prepone and thrice are perfectly reasonable English words, they tell me. So having that matrix, now it might be the person speaking will flip into English and then use English as a matrix language and then put Hindi into it. That might happen, and it's quite useful to try to identify that. But having that notion of the matrix language helps us when we start trying to do analysis. What's the word order? How does the function words work? Is there morphology going on? Does that get deleted, etc.? Okay. Often there'll be flips that are going on. Often people will do filler words in one language and maybe flip into another. So this is filler words like, you know, and like, and okay. And the reverse in Hindi, acha, which isn't an English word, but often gets used by Indian speakers in English. What we can do is we can try to measure the amount of changing that's actually happening. So if we have the data, we can talk about how often are people changing, how many words are in one language as opposed to the other. And we can also look at which words. Is it content words? Is it function words? Is it strings in one language before you change into the other? And that's sort of quite useful to try to work out the type of code switching that's going on. It's not the case that you have nothing but English and then you have one word at the end that actually says, it's in a different language and therefore that's code switching. You put la on the end and now you get Manglish. out of it? No. It's usually some form of mixing, and defining that mixing can actually be relatively hard to do. Okay, and depending on the language switching that's happening, it could have different definitions, especially if the languages have got very similar grammar. For example, it's quite common for Spanish speakers in the United States to speak both English and Spanish completely fluently. They speak this code switch Spanglish form, and because of the grammar of these two languages is incredibly similar, it's much more fluid than, say, what you might get in Hindi English, where the grammars are really quite different, verb final and therefore pro-drop. There's lots of things that are different between those languages. Sometimes the languages that are being chosen are a big education language and a local language. That's actually quite common, and people will do that all over the planet, where they've got their own local dialect and they've got the one that's spoken in the main city. I'm a Scottish English speaker, and certainly that is one thing that I used to do when I lived in Scotland. Depending on who I was talking to, I might use Scots dialect and float in and out of English. Sometimes those other languages are the education language, it's the colonial language, and it shows that you have education, it shows that you're sophisticated, it shows that you're being nice to the invaders. All of those reasons, complex reasons that why you might actually want to do it. But Hinglish is a really good example of it. There are lots of Hinglish speakers on the planet. It's probably the one with the most example data. And Hindi has definitely changed even over the last 50 years from being somewhat purely Hindi into lots more borrowed English, to the extent that it's hard for a Hindi speaker to not use English words in their Hindi, which is slightly different from a Japanese speaker not using English words in their Japanese, because in Japanese, most of the English words are borrowed words directly rather than actually aspects of the grammar, while in English, there's much more grammar related things that are going on. Chinglish and Chinese English is relatively common in bilingual places, so that includes places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Carnegie Mellon University, where we have lots of Chinese speakers. You're probably aware of that, where things are mixed all the time, and that is something that is growing. In these languages, I've got similar grammar, but there's lots of sharing that's going on. Okay, Spanglish I mentioned. African American English and Standard English is also something that happens in North America. Many Black Americans will use a standard language, African American English, which is different than Standard English. It's got different grammar, it's got different choice of words, it's certainly got different pronunciation of standard words, and they will mix between them depending on the situation that they're actually in. Okay. In almost all of the cases that people are very fluent in both languages, and they can speak each of the languages, but they're just mixing it because it's more convenient. Okay. When do they code switch? Well, there's lots of reasons, and that's one of the things that would be quite interesting to look at further, and hopefully in the discussion we'll get a chance to do some of that. Sometimes it's vocabulary. So, you know, if you're talking about Hindi food, you probably don't want to translate it into English. You just want to use the Hindi name for it. And likewise, you know, there could be a difference, even though it's the same thing. So potato, the English potato in English means a certain type of potato in dishes that you would build with potato, while aloo is the Hindi word for it, where you might use that for Hindi dishes. So you've now got two words for sort of the same thing that you could choose between them. And that happens quite a lot. Again, that happens in English, where we've got doctor and physician, or we've got car and we've got automobile. They mean the same thing-ish, but not exactly the same. Sometimes we are doing it to show off to friends, either to be part of the group and actually be local, or show that we actually have education or sophistication, and so there'll be choices that happen with that. And sometimes we just do it because it's easier and the other person knows it, and your brain's not quite thinking at the right time, and you end up using the word from one language rather than the other. So there might not be good reasons for doing it. There seems to be something that people are more open about their sentiment within their local language, as opposed to the other language. So this was a study in English that people seem to give more direct opinions in Hindi than what they would do if they were just giving it English. It might be a politeness thing, it's sort of unclear, but there seems to be some evidence that as people go into their more native dialect, they're more likely to actually be more truthful, or maybe that's truthful is wrong, it's not that they're lying in the other one, but they're actually going to be more open about their opinions. This was looking at language choice for tweets. There's also this entrainment thing that happens. So if somebody uses a term in one language, the person who's talking with them will use the same term back. Unless, okay, they feel that they don't want to be part of the person or linked with the person who's on the other side. And in fact, there is a study that Yulia was doing, Yulia Svetkov was doing, where she could see that Ukrainian news reporters in interviews that were all in English would tend to use Ukrainian phrases to refer to things that were still fully understandable in Russian, but the choice was on the Ukrainian side when interviewing a Russian-speaking person. Okay, so it doesn't mean that they might align; they might disalign them somewhat deliberately. There might also just be different semantics, subtle semantics that is going on. One is a more general term, or one is a more specific term between the two languages, and therefore it's more convenient to be able to do that. Why do we care about this? Everybody speaks English in Putonghua, so why do we care about these other languages? Why do we care how people actually communicate? Newspapers, Wikipedia are not going to have code switched or Pidgin. I mean, they have a bit, but not really, because people are going to go into their formal education mode. So why should we care about actually doing NLP? Code switching is how people actually communicate. If you go and grab some Indian person's phone and break their privacy and look at all of the text messages that they've sent, they're all going to be Romanized in English if they're Hindi speakers, okay? Or almost all, okay? Because that's how people actually communicate. And so are we we're not interested in spying on people's phones, but we are interested in how people actually communicate. It's how people type in questions into Google and Bing. They do code switching all the time. It's how they talk on call centers. It's how they write their actual opinions, probably. They use code switching when they're trying to define group membership. So if you want to say something about cricket, you better say it in English, because then you'll be shown that you're actually a native person who knows about cricket. So maybe people trust code switched communication better. You might get a better response by telling people in English that they have to wear a mask rather than English that they have to wear a mask. So there can be advantages from that, or telling them to wash their hands or whatever. So Facebook, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple all want to understand code switch data. They like to be able to build systems that can actually do it. Why is it hard? Well, it's actually quite hard because most of our data sets don't contain code switch data. In fact, most of the time we remove code switch data from any data that we're building these big pre-trained language models from. That's not completely true. Roberta is actually a wee bit better from that point of view, but it's still the case that it's often looked upon as some mixed language that we're not sure about and we're going to extract it. It's very noisy. When people write in code switch form, they don't have a standardized writing form. The spelling is going to be random. So you've got much more variability in the possible way that the word could get written, and you've got less of it. So unlike in English or French, there's a standardized way of doing it. So you're going to get much more noise already. I mean, we can deal with that, but you know, it's going to be harder. Our favorite word embeddings are often confused, because what you now have is you have an English word and you have a Hindi word, and they're right next to each other. So the context for the English word has got some English in it and some Hindi, and the context for the Hindi word, which is Romanized, it's not written in Devanagari, has got some English and Hindi round about it, possibly in a non-standard order. So you're already got really weird context when you're looking at word embeddings for things in code switching. So everything gets worse, okay? It doesn't fail, but it all gets worse. And there's not good examples. If we went and collected enough data of English, BART, etc., would just be fine, but it's not. And English is the one that's got lots of data in it. every single regional language in India, every single regional language in Southeast Asia, where English might be involved in some British Empire thing that happened before, will also have some form of code switching, and therefore we just don't have good data for it. Okay. Often it's casual, it's speech, it's not in the well-written things, it really is in natural communications of social media. Where do we find this data? Well, it's harder to verify that we actually have it and hard to find out when it's good. Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, social media is a good place to find it, but it is very noisy. Collecting is particularly hard. You need the right environment. People need to be in the right environment to do it. If you take a bunch of people who normally code switch and put them in a Python programming environment, they're probably just going to use English. Okay, though that's not completely true. As one of my Telugu students was saying to me that she remembered that she was discussing a homework with her friend in Telugu, and all of the words were in English because it was a machine learning homework. But it was all in Telugu word order. Okay, and they were communicating for some time before Kathy noticed that, oh, that's right, I should go and tell Alan that I'm actually code switching in grammar, but really not in words. And I would have been able to understand pretty much the whole conversation and maybe even answer the questions, but it was actually in Telugu, and it was using, you know, stochastic gradient descent type words that Telugu doesn't seem to have a word for. Also be aware there's different types of code switching, because there's probably the one that you do when you're talking about homework. There's the one that you're talking to your friends about what you're going to do in the evening. There's the ones that you go and talk to your family. And there's probably different types of that that we don't really fully understand yet. What about data? Well, we now have regular workshops. There's sort of one every year. One's focused on speech, one's focused on text. Sunyana Sitaram, who's at Microsoft Research in Bangalore, India, wrote this code switching speech and language processing paper. I was one of the authors as well, where it sort of looked at all the data sets, but it's out of date because it's 2 years old. Tamar Solorio at University of Houston also has good resources to try to identify that. Well, people are usually concentrating on English, Spanglish, and Chinglish, even though there's a lot more going on the planet than that. What sort of tasks do we do? Language ID is typically one of the first things, either in text or in speech, where we have a string of code switch data. We've got to know which language is going on so we can do something about it. And that can be quite hard to actually define, especially take the Spanish, where the word might be the same in both languages, but the pronunciation is the only thing that's actually different. Okay, for the Hindi speakers, you know, the word doctor is really the Hindi word for doctor. Okay, it's a borrowed word from English. It's been there for 300 years, and it really is the standard word that you would use. I don't think that's code switching. Okay, but maybe iPhone is. Okay, speech recognition and speech synthesis. How well can we recognize it? And it's mostly due to the fact that we don't have good language models for these code mixed languages, and therefore it's sort of hard to actually do that. In synthesis, what you have to be careful about, if you're speaking in Hindi and come up with an English word, you shouldn't just speak it in standard American, because it's jarring if you do that. Okay, those of you who speak multiple languages and meet somebody in America who grew up here and speaks your language, say Chinese or Hindi, it's always weird when you listen to them because they speak in Chinese, and then you get this completely anglicized English word in there, and that's just weird. That's not how a Chinese person would do it, or a Hindi speaker would do it, where somebody is American born Indian. So when you're doing speech synthesis, you've got to get the right amount of mix in the language, so when it's spoken, it sounds okay. When we listen to the examples of Manglish, Malaysian, and English, okay, all of the English words were pronounced not completely English-like. Okay, they were pronounced in a Manglish way, and they were still the English words, but that's something you need to care about. Spelling normalization, it's really quite interesting. Indians can spell, but they can't spell when they write English. Okay, even the Hindi words, and it's utterly random. I mean, it's not utterly random, but you know, there's an awful lot of noise in there, and they'll sometimes write phonetically, and they'll sometimes just get it, well, I don't know, wrong. So there's noise there that you have to actually deal with. of some form. It might be good to get part-of-speech tagging, and people try to do that, and how to do cross-lingual part-of-speech tagging when we're doing it. And there are some data sets for that. What sort of tasks at the higher level? Named entity recognition would be incredibly important. You want to know what people are talking about, especially people, places, entities, etc. And there's going to be a cross-lingual aspect, and you want to make sure that you capture that. Sentiment analysis is actually quite interesting because, as I said, it seems that people are maybe a little bit more open with their opinions in their native language than what they would be if they're writing a more formal English review of something. So what did they really think about the movie? Question answering, because often this happens, especially Google and Bing are very much aware of that. Natural language inference. Dialogue processing, so there are people looking at how we can get people to code switch when they're talking to a machine, and what's the benefits of being able to do that. And there's this whole thing of when should we do it? Should we do language generation code switched or not? Is it an advantage? Does it depend what we're actually talking about? Is it good to fit in, or will it look bad to try to fit in? We all know that trying to fit in is much worse than not fitting in. Code switching techniques, most of them are very similar to the low resource things. You've got to try and find appropriate data. You've got to try and bootstrap labeling. You've got to try some interesting forms of data augmentation, some form of generation techniques, and finding new reliable evaluation techniques is always important. How do you know you're actually even getting better, are things that are actually quite hard. Where do we find it? Social media sites are probably the best where you're going to get it. Code switching is pretty common in many forms. So YouTube, Reddit, YouTube speech is really good. So you can usually find people speaking on YouTube forms in both English and Chinglish. It's relatively common. Actually, the Google Indian English ASR is a Hinglish ASR, and it's been trained to recognize Hindi English when it's spoken, and they actually spent a lot of time doing it and never advertised. We started using the Google Indian English ASR to try to label things that were in English, and then we discovered it was incredibly good. So I mailed my friend there and said, what's going on? And she said, oh yeah, we made it do this. We've been working on this for 3 years, but we're not allowed to announce it, so we can't announce it. But it's actually quite interesting how well that they're doing that. Broadcast news, Bibles, etc. are usually all monolingual. In fact, they might even be weirdly more in the target language. So, for example, in the Hindi case, you might even get news in Hindi where the Hindi speaker will go, what does that word mean? And they need to be told in English because they don't normally use that word apart from in English. Reddit, or whatever the local equivalent is, Twitter, Weibo, whatever the local thing is that's appropriate to be able to find that. Bootstrapping labeling, actually, in a course that we ran 2 years ago called Multilingual NLP, it's a really good course. I recommend that you do it. One of the projects was actually looking at bootstrapping sentiment data cross-lingually. The idea being that if you have a sentiment labeler that's only in English, could you label English data and start getting data that's labeled with sentiment, positive or negative, and then actually use that data to retrain. And we worked on various ways in the project and ended up publishing this, so that what we end up doing is we end up with a system that only uses the English parts of it, and it can label things, but it learns some of the other words as we get more and more Hindi in it, such that as we do this bootstrapping technique, it then depends more on the Hindi side of the information rather than the English side. And we also did it for, I can't remember if it was Telugu or Tamil, but it was one of those other, which has similar mixing, but is not the same language. Data augmentation generation, building a generator from limited data. This is something we'd like to be able to do. We have some data, can we generate some more? Most of the things that we do in NLP now are very word oriented, so they really benefit from having much more surface level word rather than, say, parse trees, which would be even harder to actually get. And so if we could generate data, maybe by mixing and matching, the same thing that Graham was talking about when we're talking about augmentation in machine translation, we'd like to be able to do that too, but it's surprisingly hard to do. You build a classifier that tells you whether something is mixed or not, and you generate some data, and your classifier goes, yep, that's English, because it's got one Hindi word at the end. It's got hi at the end, and then that's it. But no, that's not what good code switching actually is. And that's really hard to do well, okay? You might think it's trivial because you can recognize it, but when you start generating it, you end up with things that match the classifier that you're looking for, good English, but you show it to a English speaker and they go, yeah, nobody would ever say that. That's just weird. So we try to do that, and we've done various ways, and not just us, lots of other people on the planet, often Singapore, often India, places where people care about code switching, to see if we can generate good data, see if we can not differentiate it from natural data, and then find ways of trying to find out whether that new data that we're generating is actually going to help and, say, improving word embedding on some downstream task. Okay. How do we evaluate? Well, it's actually quite hard, because we might be able to evaluate that it's code switch, but we want to know whether it's good. We want to know whether it's going to help. And so can we do things like engage people in conversation? Can we answer questions? Can we do web search? So things like dialogue understanding, summarization, question answering are things that we actually want to do. Microsoft India, in a paper, have come up with a somewhat standard technique called glucose, which allows us to be able to test whether embeddings that we get are good on 8 different tasks. And that's something that we will often do. There may be still issues in things like glucose because we might overtrain to it, but it's a good standardized way for looking at for English, but that's only for Hindi and English, but doesn't deal even with just the other languages in India. Finally, code switching, Pidgins and Creoles. Multilingual is much more varied than just one single language. Code switching is mixed within the utterances. That's probably the best way to define it. A Pidgin is non-native, mixed lingua franca. So nobody are speaking it natively, so it's a bunch of non-natives speaking it. Creoles are when a Pidgin becomes native in its own language, which means kids are speaking it natively. And you're probably talking about 2 or 3 generations before that's really going to move through an area to do that. The issues are still very hard. The monolingual casual speech, and monolingual casual speech is still pretty hard in most languages on the planet. We just don't have enough data and enough context to know how to deal with that yet. So the discussion point that I want you to do today is I want you to select 2 languages that have some level of code switching. You'll have examples of that somewhere, and it might be in a particular situation, including CMU if it is. We'd like to understand the different types of code switching. So when people are doing different things in code switching, and these types might be matrix language decisions. Which language do you choose or do the people choose when they're actually speaking about different things? What happens in cross-lingual morphological issues? How does plurals get down? What do you do with gender if you're copying a word that doesn't have gender into a language that does have gender? Cross-lingual style issues, politeness, register, etc. Low-level semantic distinctions. Stylistic semantic distinctions, there might be things about trying to be more city than rural or others. Okay, so we are running out of time, but let's see what we can do. We're not going to report back, but let's split off into our groups and see if we can answer any of these questions.